From the 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus. Today, examining the impact federal budget cuts will have on Western Massachusetts. Here's Laura Hutchinson.
Good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Laura Hutchinson. You've likely been hearing the word sequestration over the past few weeks. Maybe you understand what it means and how it affects you, and maybe you don't. That's where 22 News in Focus comes in. Today we're going to talk to our congressman about what it is and if anything can be done to stop it now that it's past its deadline. We'll also talk to two local agencies who will be directly affected if nothing is done. But first, joining us today, we have our Western Massachusetts Congressman Richard Neal. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for the invitation, Laura.
Thank you. Now, you voted against this whole idea back in 2011, this idea of just across-the-board budget cuts. Talk to me about what this really means for those people who don't quite understand.
Well, I think it's a very fallow procedure. I think it's very empty, and I think that you're elected to pick and choose and to set priorities and to determine what's important. Across-the-board cuts have never made any sense to me. In this instance, the process of sequestration, it's another manufactured crisis. It comes on the heels of the arguments over the debt ceiling, continuing resolutions, fiscal cliff issues. And when you set these artificial deadlines, what you do is you back up against them. Polarized debate, excitable language doesn't solve the problem, and you find yourself, as we did with sequestration, a procedure that was embraced because both sides thought it would never happen.
But it did happen.
It did happen.
We got to this point. So what was the plan? Was it never to reach this deadline? Was it to reach this deadline and stop it?
The inside calculation essentially was that Republicans would never go along with cuts to defense spending, and the Democrats would never go along with cuts to domestic spending. The result was that that would force the two sides, compel them, if you will, to reach an accord, only to discover, with about a week left, that not only was there not an accord, but the conversation broke down.
Yeah, it seemed like this wasn't even the topic of conversation leading up to. I mean, was there some real negotiation happening?
I think there were early on conversations. The idea that oftentimes in negotiating that there are certain incentives that bring one to the table, and then you find that the alternative is so far worse than the original proposal that you're kind of impelled to reach an agreement, only to discover here that the harsh language didn't get us there.
So this is $1.2 trillion in budget cuts now. Lots of it involved in the defense spending, as you were saying.
It's about 8% in immediate defense spending cuts, and obviously civilian military employees will feel it. Military contractors will feel it. On the domestic front, Head Start will feel it. You conceivably will have longer lines at airports. It's undoubted. I can't say that anything's going to happen in the next couple of days that's going to turn this around, but it's doubtful that there'll be big changes in the next couple of weeks, that's for sure.
So is this something that is still a part of the conversation in Washington right now, or is this...
There is an opportunity, and you ask a very good question. There is another opportunity here based on what is known as the continuing resolution. The continuing resolution is oftentimes applied when you can't reach a budget accommodation. What happens instead is that through the continuing resolution, you put enough money in place to, in fact, keep the government up and running until October 1st. Now, that sequestration that you've just described actually plays out against this deadline on March 27th. So there's an opportunity here in the next 2 weeks to try to mitigate, if you will, some of these proposed cuts. Remember, with sequestration, what the term really means is that you're setting aside previously appropriated money to kind of take it back. And there have been all kinds of constitutional questions raised over many years as to whether or not the process in and of itself is even lawful.
Okay, and so this is something that could, you use the term, mitigated, but it sounds like much of this will end up going through, or at least continuing.
Well, there's still time for people to come to good sense and to try to find an agreement. I think that makes the most sense, and I think that people are tired of these, again, manufactured crises.
Do these cuts need to happen? We constantly talk about, our financial situation.
Let me just say this based on a long history of examining these questions. You're not going to tax your way out of this, and you're not going to cut your way out of it. So I think there are going to be cuts, and there's going to be a revenue perspective to this as well. I think it's also important to understand that I think if we took a little bit of a deep breath here and stopped kind of the deadline legislation that has been embraced, if this unemployment rate could just be dialed back over the next couple of years to the historic post-war norm of 5%, 1/3 of these deficits go away because personal income tax revenue goes up, cap gains go up, pressure on social spending goes way down. In addition, once the economy, as noted by jobs figures this week, where 236,000 new jobs have been created, that means 236,000 people are going to be paying personal income taxes. That's a huge issue. And those people who are going to be taking those jobs, they're no longer perhaps receiving unemployment benefits. So again, some of this pressure comes off. And I think that taking that deep breath that I've just described and saying, look, let's postpone some rash decisions here, everybody would be better off.
Yeah, but at what point do you say, there are criticisms when you spend more, and then there are criticisms when you cut back because then people lose their jobs. At what point do you weigh the economy and, what we're doing financially?
Yeah, there is precedent. In 1998, if you recall, the last Clinton budget, which was enormously successful, give President Bush Sr. credit once and President Clinton credit twice for the budgets that they embraced that were not popular. And if you recall, with Clinton's second budget, there were $500 billion worth of tax increases and $500 billion worth of revenue cuts. I'm sorry, program cuts. And I think in that instance, that was an example of what we might do here as the model to go forward.
Is there an understanding that, we're watching all of this happen, and you and I were talking earlier about the fiscal cliff earlier this year. We constantly talk about raising the debt ceiling. We talk about, there's this frustration growing that lawmakers aren't hearing what people are saying, that things need to be talked about and considered. Is that something that...
One of the problems in the legislative process that I think should be noted, the American people, Laura, are very divided about what course of action to take.
Right.
The base of the Republican Party has said no revenue, and the base of the Democratic Party has said no cuts. So trying to, through the reflection of elected service, to reach an agreement when many of the people that have in fact voted for you have said they don't like the proposals that are in front of us makes it much more difficult. The president, I think, has made now a conciliatory effort with Republicans to try to move them off of some of the positions they've taken. The difficulty for them is then they run the risk of a primary back in their respective constituencies.
Sure.
That's the nature of the challenge in front of them.
What is next? What are the next deadlines we're looking at, and what do you think is ahead?
March 27th is the next deadline. That's the continuing resolution. If the continuing resolution that Republicans passed in the House of Representatives this week goes into effect, then that means the president will accept the cuts in sequestration. That's going to be very difficult for him to swallow.
Okay, so it's that March 27th deadline that we're looking at now. What about, talks about raising the debt ceiling again? That's something that we're also going to have to be dealing with in the next couple of months.
Well, if you get through sequestration in terms of this continuing resolution, you resolve some of these issues, then the debt ceiling issue ameliorates itself. I think, and then by that time passions have cooled and debate is calmed. Sure. So I think there's a chance to say, let's raise the debt ceiling. My suggestion on the debt ceiling, raise it for 2 years so that we don't come back to it again immediately in this atmosphere. Okay,
and then very quickly, is there anything that you're excited about that's happening right now? There's just been a lot of talk about.
There's a couple of things to be very excited about, Laura. America is closer to energy independence than we've ever been in our history. When you consider that in the year 2022, we may well now be in a position where we will become the largest oil exporter in the world, the abundance of natural gas, clean energy, green energy. We have a chance to restore American manufacturing if this is done right. There are all kinds of opportunities. The budget is actually getting better, even though we're not arguing that it's wonderful, that's for sure, but it's already getting a bit better on the edges. And I think that these are noteworthy achievements, and not to miss the fact that in a time of crises, in a time of doubt, this is when you should be preparing for the good days.
And as you've said, all the branches of government are continuing. It's these other big topics that make the headlines, but there are many things that are passing and moving forward all the time.
Well, listen, the president just a couple of days ago signed the Violence Against Women Act. That's a significant piece of legislation. It had been mired in controversy for years. All of a sudden, it's passed. The Voting Rights Act is before the Supreme Court, where it's likely that if the Supreme Court takes one position, the Congress will take another. I mean, so the work of government goes on. The difficulty is, certainly the focus is on the impasse.
Very good. Congressman Richard Neal, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us
Laura.
about this.
Always good to be with you.
Thank you so much. And after the break, we'll be talking with the commander of Westover Air Reserve Base about how they're going to be affected by this sequestration. So stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about sequestration and how it will affect our region. We just spoke with Congressman Richard Neal about what the federal government is doing to alleviate the situation. Joining us now, we have Colonel Stephen Beautrain, commander of the 439th Airlift Wing at Westover Air Reserve Base in Chicopee. Colonel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laura. It's good to be here.
You heard my conversation with the congressman. You know, this is something that happened, and there's a chance to mitigate it, sounds like, but really this is something that we do sort of need to embrace. And you were saying that this is something you've already started planning for.
Yes, we've already seen some of the effects. As a matter of fact, we're cutting back on flying hours. And we had a tanker that was supposed to fly to support one of our flights on Tuesday, and their hours were cut back so they couldn't fly, and we need to keep our air crews current and qualified to do air refueling. So since they didn't have a tanker, they didn't get the training, so that's a loss of training, and that's what we expect to see here throughout sequestration, are people receiving less training, and that'll also affect readiness.
How do you think that this is going to affect you in the big picture? I mean, you're talking about things that are starting to happen right now. Is this something that you are planning will be a major impact on the base?
Yes, it will. It'll definitely impact all the people on the base. It'll also impact all of our operations, maintenance, support, and medical. Really, the biggest effect will be on our civilians. That'll be the most apparent. We have 759 civilians on the base. The vast majority of them are going to be furloughed.
Wow.
We're working that with the Air Force right now. We don't really have the guidance on it, but more than likely notices will go out later this month for furlough, 30 days notice, and then beginning in late April, they'll be furloughed for 1 day a week for the remainder of the fiscal year, which will be about 22 weeks, and that equates to a 20% pay cut, which is a big hit for a lot of people.
How serious is this, you know, to security, you know, in the big picture, the fact that defense cuts were included in this, or a big part of this even, you know, how serious is this?
Well, it's very serious to the overall readiness of the U.S. military, not just of the 439th Airlift Wing. And the key is they're using money to support operations overseas, which is good, but the thing is we have to maintain training to be able to send people over, and for our air crews to go fly missions. The missions themselves are not being cut, but a pilot has to have so many takeoffs and landings and instrument approaches per month, and if we don't have the money for that, and also many of those are actually dual status citizen soldiers. They are a Air Reserve technician, means that they have a federal job during the week and then they're a reservist on the weekends.
Okay.
And of those 759, about 423 of those are Air Reserve technicians. So those uniform-wearing people will be furloughed alongside the straight civilians.
Wow. So what do you do when you start to have these gaps in employees, you know, and people not getting trained, you know? How do you continue the mission and do what it is you are supposed to do every day?
Well, it's one of the things about the military is we accept what happens to us and we do the best we can and we try to prioritize. And what we'll do is we won't be able to keep everyone trained. We'll have to take a look at who's available, who we can maintain the status on. Most important really are instructors, because the instructors have to be there to instruct the others. But we'll have to take the hard look at who is going to be able to maintain currency and who won't be able to maintain currency. And that means fewer crews. Because we are an operational reserve, which means we're flying missions all the time. Right now we actually have 3 aircraft that are out flying in the world, flying missions. But as a strategic reserve, we're ready to go to war or to go do humanitarian operations anywhere in the world. By not being ready, we can't support that as much as we could. We have 16 airplanes. 14 of them are ready to go anytime. Right now, if we were to be mobilized in 72 hours, we could have all 14 of those airplanes out with crews flying missions anywhere in the world. With the sequestration and the cutbacks on training, then we won't be able to train to that standard, and we probably won't be able to get all 14 of those aircraft out to go do whatever they need to do.
Is there movement from the base to, get in touch with the lawmakers and to, explain to them what this is doing to you? And, has there been that conversation?
I think they understand that, and that's taken at much higher levels than me. And I know that the Pentagon and the services are in touch with Congress and with the administration to try to work this out and let them know what this is causing. The problem is that there need to be cuts somewhere. Sequestration is just an across-the-board cut. And what that does is it takes away the ability of the services to cut where they would like to cut. So we end up having to go into civilian pay, into flying hours, into training, all the things where we would like to be able to save money and cut elsewhere. And I know that the services are trying to work that, but ultimately the U.S. military works for civilian bosses. And it's up to the representatives of the government to sit down together, figure out the best way to save money in the budget, and then pass that down to us. And we just hope that they can do it so that we can do our mission. Do
you get concerned when you see these cuts begin, though? Of course, we've seen bases close in the past, and budget cuts are nothing new to you. Do you get concerned about, the financial stability and where this is going in the future?
Well, there's somewhat concern. Westover has been very strong and received a lot of support, and because of our really important national security mission of flying the C-5. Plus, we're also a host to the Army, the Navy, Marines, and we actually have a new Guard unit that's on base now also. That happened from the BRAC in 2005. So since they've consolidated all of those units at Westover as a money-saving major move, then that works out very well for us in the future to be taken as we've invested this money to make Westover a joint base. And we hope that will help in any kind of future endeavors.
Colonel, I want to thank you so much for joining us with Westover Air Reserve Base in Chicopee. Do appreciate you talking to us about this, and we will, of course, stay in touch and continue to monitor the situation as well with you. Thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. And next, we're going to talk about how the sequester will affect social programs. After this, so stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about the effects of the sequestration. We've spoken to Congressman Richard Neal and the commander of a local Air Reserve base here in Western Mass. Joining us now, we have Stephen Huntley, the executive director of the Valley Opportunity Council, to talk to us about how the sequestration could affect that organization. And just for those who don't know, that the Valley Opportunity Council provides services, home heating assistant, nutrition, housing, early education, a whole array of services. Very important to the community as well. So talk to us about how the sequestration is affecting you.
Well, right now we've already we've had 5 folks leave. We haven't replaced. We really don't know exactly or precisely how it's going to impact us on a day-to-day basis. Those numbers haven't been released yet. We believe we believe there's going to be significant cuts to our fuel assistance program, but it looks like it's going to be next year. What that would mean for us is longer lines for folks applying. Longer wait times to get the benefit. It's a very important benefit, and oftentimes it's an emergency program. So it may be that the oil delivery doesn't come as quickly as it would as it should.
Is this one of the largest cuts that you've taken in your experience? I mean, compare this to when you have a budget come out and you just don't get as much as you thought you were going to get.
We've had larger cuts, but unfortunately those larger cuts we had a little more control of. This is an across-the-board cut that we can't evaluate where the best place is to do it. So the only control we have right now is we don't want to impact program services or the amount of money that the participants would receive. So we've made the strategic decision to impact the actual benefit, the staffing rather, so that staffing is where the cuts come in, as opposed to the benefit to the consumer at the end.
Has there been any conversations with the consumer just about what they could be expecting in the coming days or weeks or months?
There's been small pockets of that, but unfortunately we don't have a clear and defined scope of how much we're going to lose in the cuts. So it's very hard to, as an organization, we don't like to go out and run around like Chicken Little and say the sky's falling until we have concrete information. And unfortunately, that concrete information is slow to come for all of the non-discretionary funding out there.
What was your reaction when you realized that you were going to be included in this and that, you do have such valuable services?
I was shocked, frankly. I was shocked, and now I'm concerned because, and the congressman alluded to it a little bit earlier, the sequestration was the first step, and then after that, the continuing resolution expires March the 27th. The legislators weren't able to come together to prevent sequestration, so I don't know if they're able to come together for the continuing resolution. And then after that, you alluded to it earlier in the segment, the debt ceiling will need to be raised at some point in time. Will they be able to come together and resolve that issue? It's all very concerning. And at the time of these revenues going down, or the budget cuts happening, we're going to see an increase in participation in our programs. Early on, we're going to see the Westover folks come into our facilities, and Westover and Barnes and all the military folks that are involved. And then after that, local manufacturing is going to take a dive from this. A lot of local manufacturing relies on military spending, and there's going to be layoffs in those sectors, and they're going to find their way coming in for services, and we're frankly not going to have the staff that we had at one point in time to help these folks through their scenario. It's
scary. It really is scary. What is the backup when you have this type of situation? I mean, there must be, where can people turn if, it turns out that funds are running short for you?
We've been investing in partnerships and in the community to try and help. We hope the business sector can help us along the way. We own some commercial properties that we hope that will pay us some dividends, so to speak, so that we'll be able to continue to keep essential staff on, to keep connecting folks. What's important to recognize is a lot of the folks that are coming to us now have never asked for help before, so they need a lot more hand-holding than folks that have been through the system before and understand what benefits are out there for them.
It's sad. It's very, very much so a double-edged sword, sounds like.
Indeed it is, yes.
Very good. Thank you so much, Stephen Huntley. I do appreciate you coming on to talk to us about this very important issue and letting us know how this could possibly affect you and everyone, really, who relies on your services. So I do appreciate that. Thank you so much. We're going to have the last word for you after the break, so stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. We've been talking today about the sequestration and how that will or is starting to affect us here in Western Massachusetts. We got to hear from Congressman Richard Neal directly and talk to two organizations that are already being directly affected. That is our program for today. Thanks to our guests for joining us. Thanks at home for watching. If you've missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website at WWLP.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday.